I have no illusions that this video will by any means convince one side or the other that they're in the wrong in their assessment of the historical Jesus, but rather I will present the arguments in which I agree and disagree on both sides of this issue. To start off, perhaps I should make my position clear. I am an atheist and an anti-theist. Further than that, I'm an atheist anti-theist who thinks that the odds of Christianity being true are about as likely as me being killed by a stampede of unicorns. After about 7 or 8 years of dealing with counter-apologetics, reading the arguments for both sides, and spending a good amount of downtime honestly looking at both sides of that argument, I can't even seriously entertain the idea that Christianity has anything more to offer in terms of universal truth than any other religion at any other time or place in human history. I say all of this to assure anyone watching that I have no dog in this fight, as they say. Whether or not the historical Jesus existed wouldn't shake me either way. That being said, I am in the camp who thinks that the historical Jesus most likely did exist. I've both read and heard the arguments from both sides of this conversation. As a co-host on the Skeptic Fence show, link below, I've personally spoken to Bart D. Ehrman, who is a leading authority on the Bible and the life of Jesus, as well as a professor of religious studies at the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill. Robert M. Price, who has a PhD in systematic theology and is currently professor of biblical criticism at the Center for Inquiry Institute. And David Fitzgerald, who is an author, public speaker, and historical researcher. For those who don't know, Professor Ehrman is in the camp that the historical Jesus did in fact exist, while the other two mentioned, Robert Price and David Fitzgerald, are mythicists who hold an opposing view. I haven't personally spoken with Richard Carrier, but I'm currently reading his book, Proving History, Bayes' Theorem and the Quest for the Historical Jesus. But I think his thoughts will be included mainly because Fitzgerald's book, Nailed, is essentially co-written by Carrier since he quotes Carrier nearly on every other page. As far as what I'll be doing here, I'm just going to state the case as I see it and explain why I think it's most likely that a historical Jesus did in fact exist. Hopefully, if you hold an opposing idea, you will feel free to share it, and if you've never entertained the conversation either way, hopefully you'll find your interest piqued. Certainty. So to begin, I want to address what I think is a problem for both sides here. This is the problem of certainty. When dealing with history, we can only ever say that people or an event likely or unlikely happened. Sometimes we can see something as extremely likely, for example, George Washington crossing the Delaware, or we can see something as extremely unlikely, like aliens building Stonehenge. The thing to keep in mind is that stories in history do not have the luxury of being put in a lab and tested. So the best that can be ascertained is what most likely did or did not happen. One thing I found on this topic in particular is that both sides seem pretty adamant that their positions are correct, which is understandable, but go to the point of saying that their views are certain. I'm not convinced enough either way to say that I'm certain. I can only say what seems most likely, and as we get deeper into the argument, I'll explain why. The Gospels. To ask whether or not the historical Jesus actually existed, we need to look at all of our earliest sources of information. The New Testament canon contains 4 Gospels which most everyone is familiar with: Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. So who wrote these Gospels? It's unknown. What is known is that the authors of the Gospels definitely weren't eyewitnesses and certainly weren't the disciples of Jesus known as Matthew, Mark, Luke, or John. These titles were given to these Gospels much later. How do we know that? A good telling sign is that most of the general population of Judea in the 1st century were illiterate. Aside from that, the people in the area at the time spoke Aramaic. The Gospels are written in Greek and at a later period. Not only that, but generally the Gospels don't even claim to be written by eyewitnesses. They were written long after the stories would have taken place and by authors speaking a different language in a different part of the world who gathered their Gospels from scattered writings and/or oral tradition. In the chart being presented, the Gospels are dated in chronological order. This shows when Jesus would have lived and when the Gospels were written in relation to that period. As you can see, the first Gospel, Mark, was written around 66 to 70 CE. This means that the first Gospel we have was written around 40 years after the stories it tells. About 10 or 15 years after that, the Gospels of Luke and Matthew were written. These Gospels base a good deal of their writing on Mark. The Gospel of Luke shares 50% of Mark's text, and the Gospel of Matthew contains a 90% reproduction of Mark. As David Fitzgerald puts it in his book, Nailed, which he was nice enough to send me a personalized copy, this means out of 661 verses in the Gospel of Mark, Luke's Gospel uses about 360 of the same verses, and Matthew uses about 607. The differences between Mark, Luke, and Matthew are also thought to be linked to a no longer existing source known as Q, which could have been either another no longer existing written gospel or more stories being passed down through oral tradition, or perhaps a mixture of both. So our earliest gospel was written approximately 40 years after the events it describes. This is compelling when you think of how information that did survive made it to that point. This means that the stories of Jesus, his preaching, and his works cycled around the area for 4 decades before someone wrote them down. It isn't hard to see how anyone could make a case that these stories are largely exaggerated or completely made up, and to be honest, I'm not trying to make a case against that. As I alluded to earlier, I am convinced that most of the stories in the Gospels are entirely fictitious and never happened, at least as they are described. But that isn't the point of this conversation. This conversation has to do with whether or not a historical figure was the basis for these stories. You'll notice that I have yet to mention the 4th Gospel, the Gospel of John. I wanted to get the first 3 out of the way before I moved into John because it segues the topic into another issue we have to discuss. When Christians talk even about the biblical Jesus, there's a bit of a problem. As I see it, there is no biblical Jesus, only conflicting biblical Jesuses. Jesus, as described in Mark, is very tame and much more of a preacher who knows some magic tricks. In the Gospels of Luke and Matthew, Jesus seems to have much more of a divine presence. It's in these 2 Gospels and these 2 Gospels alone that Jesus is said to have been born of a virgin. In the Gospel of John, which was written much later than the other Gospels, around the turn of the 1st century, Jesus is outspokenly divine. John is the last of the Gospels and is the most unrelated to the first 3. It's sort of a standalone gospel, in which there is almost no interrelation from it and the other 3 Gospels. Wouldn't this make the case against the historical Jesus? I say no. Granted, the 4 Gospels can't seem to agree on the character of Jesus, even though 3 of the Gospels are closely related. But that says nothing about the fact that these stories were written about the same guy doing similar things in a similar time. The differences seem to be much more about his manner in doing these things, the timing in which he did these things, and additions about his divinity, which I've already said any skeptic should rule out as at least very, very unlikely. When I say they discuss the same guy, I feel I need to emphasize this point. All 4 Gospels seem to have different ideas about who Jesus was, but they all do agree on Jesus. Was he adopted by God at his baptism by John the Baptist, as in Mark? Was he born of a virgin, as in Luke and Matthew? Was he a pre-existing being who is one with the Father? John. That is irrelevant to the point of discussion. Though there are conflicting ideologies about who this man was, there is still no reason to doubt that there was indeed a man. And this brings me to the next point I'll begin in part 2.